4:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. USS Mason was already at general quarters, the red battle lights casting long, distorted shadows across the deck of the bridge. 14 fast attack craft had just emerged from the radar shadow of Kesham Island, moving at 45 knots on a direct intercept course that left no room for ambiguity. The humid air over the water was thick with the smell of diesel and salt spray, a heavy mist clinging to the surface of the sea that would have blinded a lesser ship. But the destroyer was not blind. The commanding officer stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the blue-tinted glass of the Aegis combat system display. At 4:15 in the morning, the quiet routine of the night watch had been replaced by the disciplined urgency of a crew prepared for the worst. The 14 contacts were cutting through the black water, their wakes leaving white streaks that were clearly visible on the high-resolution infrared cameras mounted on the ship's superstructure. They were moving in a staggered wedge formation, a classic aggressive posture used by the foreign military forces to swarm and overwhelm a larger opponent. The naval warship, a destroyer, DDG-87 of the Arleigh Burke-class, was operating in international waters, maintaining its position to ensure the freedom of navigation through the strategic maritime strait. The contacts were currently 28 miles away, but at their current speed, the distance was closing at a rate of nearly a mile every 60 seconds. The ship's primary radar was sweeping the horizon, sending out pulses of electromagnetic energy that tracked every minute change in the enemy's heading. Bridge. Combat. The voice of the tactical action officer came through the internal communications loop, steady and devoid of emotion. Contacts are confirmed as fast attack craft. They are not responding to the bridge-to-bridge radio hails on Channel 16. We have initiated the standard maritime warning protocols, but there is no change in their profile. They are accelerating. The air in the bridge was cool, kept at a constant temperature to protect the racks of sensitive computers, but the tension among the sailors was heavy. Outside, the Gulf was a vast, dark mirror, reflecting only the distant, flickering lights of oil tankers and the occasional orange flare from a coastal refinery. The destroyer ran dark, its own navigation lights extinguished, appearing as nothing more than a silent, massive shadow against the stars. It was a billion-dollar platform of the military forces, and its mission was absolute: defend the ship and protect the international sea lanes. The commanding officer gripped the edge of the chart table, feeling the slight vibration of the four gas turbine engines through the soles of his boots. He knew that in the next few minutes, the rules of engagement would dictate every move. The 14 boats were now 22 miles out, appearing as a cluster of angry red dots on the tactical display. "Signalman, continue the visual warnings," the commanding officer ordered. On the wings of the bridge, powerful searchlights cut through the darkness, strobing toward the horizon in a sequence designed to signal clear intent to any vessel within range. The long-range acoustic device was also activated, sending a focused, deafening beam of sound across the water that could be heard clearly even over the scream of high-performance outboard engines. Still, the 14 boats did not slow. They did not veer off. They were committed to the intercept, pushing their engines to the limit. Across the 509 feet of the ship's length, the remaining crew members scrambled to their battle stations. Steel hatches were slammed, shut and dogged down, sealing the ship into a series of watertight compartments. In the belly of the ship, damage control teams donned their heavy, fire-retardant gear and checked their oxygen tanks. The weapons technicians in the Combat Information Center were already slaving the 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun and the 25mm cannons to the primary fire control radar. The naval warship was no longer a vessel in transit. It was a BAT, fully integrated, lethal weapons system, coiled and waiting for the moment the red line was crossed. 4:25 in the morning. The bridge of the USS Mason was a hive of controlled, clinical activity. The distance between the destroyer and the approaching swarm had closed to 18 miles. The radar returns, showing the 14 Iranian craft maintaining a rigid, aggressive formation. The commanding officer stood by the primary communications console, his expression unreadable behind the glow of the tactical displays. Every 30 seconds, the radio operator transmitted a standardized warning on international maritime distress frequencies, the words echoing through the bridge with a haunting, repetitive cadence. Iranian patrol craft. This is United States Navy warship 7246. The operator's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline surely surging through his system. You are approaching a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. Your intentions are unclear. Alter your course immediately to the east to avoid a possible engagement. There was no response. The only sound coming back through the bridge speakers was the hiss of static and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the ship's own ventilation system. The silence from the Iranian side was a deliberate tactical choice, a psychological weapon intended to force the American crew into a state of uncertainty. But on the USS Mason, uncertainty was a luxury they did not permit. The crew had been trained for this exact scenario. For hundreds of hours in simulators and live-fire drills, the air on the bridge was beginning to carry the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the banks of high-powered electronics. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness was absolute. Save for the white-hot phosphorus flares, the destroyer began to launch into the sky. Each flare erupted with a sharp, percussive crack, bathing the black water in a harsh, artificial light that lasted for nearly 60 seconds before drifting slowly toward the surface. The light revealed the silhouettes of the fast attack craft, their bow waves cutting through the water like knives, their engines throwing up high plumes of white spray that glowed under the magnesium light of the flares. Still no response on Channel 16, sir, the communications officer reported, his hands hovering over the encryption keys. The lead vessel has increased speed to 48 knots. They are now 17 miles out. At this rate, they will enter the 5-mile exclusion zone in exactly 15 minutes. The commanding officer nodded once, his mind processing the mathematics of the engagement. He was following the graduated response procedures to the letter. First, verbal warnings. Second, visual signals. Third, non-lethal deterrence. The flares were part of the second phase, a clear message that the destroyer was aware of their presence and was prepared to defend itself. In the Combat Information Center, located deep within the armored citadel of the ship, the tactical action officer was already layering the ship's defenses. He watched as the 14 targets were assigned individual tracking numbers by the Aegis system. The computers were calculating the optimal firing solutions for every weapon on the ship, from the long-range missiles in the Mark 41 vertical launch system to the rapid-fire cannons mounted on the port and starboard rails. Bridge, combat, the tactical action officer's voice crackled over the internal loop. We have a firm lock on all 14 targets. Recommendation is to move to Phase 3 of the rules of engagement. The contacts are now within 12 miles and show no signs of breaking formation. The commanding officer looked out through the reinforced glass of the bridge windows. The flares were dying out, and the Gulf was being reclaimed by the darkness. He knew that the Iranian crews on those boats were likely watching the destroyer through their own binoculars, waiting for a sign of hesitation. They were betting that the United States Navy would be reluctant to fire first, hoping to use their numbers to overwhelm the ship's point defenses. Approved, the commanding officer said, his voice dropping an octave. Signalman. Initiate the long-range acoustic device at maximum volume. Communications. Continue. The radio hails every 15 seconds. Let them know the window for a peaceful resolution is closing. The deck beneath their feet shuddered slightly as the ship adjusted its heading, presenting a narrower profile to the approaching swarm. The smell of salt spray was stronger now as the destroyer picked up speed, its bow slamming into the 2-meter swells of the Gulf. Inside the bridge, the only light came from the glowing green and blue screens reflecting off the sweat-slicked foreheads of the young sailors manning the consoles. The Iranian boats were now 10 miles away. On the tactical screen, the red dots were no longer a cluster. They were individual threats, each one capable of carrying a heavy machine gun or a pair of short-range anti-ship missiles. The verbal warnings continued, a persistent, unyielding voice in the dark, but the silence from the Iranian side remained unbroken. The stage was being set for a collision that was now only minutes away. 4:30 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Mason. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter, call sign Easy Rider 6-2, sat at the center of the pitching flight deck, its twin engines beginning their low-frequency whine. The air was thick with the sharp chemical smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the fine mist of salt spray kicked up by the destroyer's 40-knot transit. In the pre-dawn darkness, the flight deck was a chaotic choreography of colored jerseys and glowing chemical lights. The purple-shirted fuel crew had just disconnected the lines, while the red-shirted ordnance technicians made their final checks on the 4 Hellfire missiles hanging from the stub wings. The helicopter's rotors began to sweep the air, the rhythmic whap-whap sound bouncing off the ship's superstructure and vibrating through the steel plating under the crew's feet. The flight deck officer, wearing a bright yellow jersey and holding 2 glowing orange wands, signaled for the chocks and chains to be pulled. Every movement was a practiced, mechanical reflex, honed by thousands of hours of repetitive training. Under the red combat lighting of the hangar bay, the technicians looked like ghosts moving through a mechanical graveyard. Inside the cockpit of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter, the pilot and co-pilot adjusted their night vision goggles, the world outside turning into a grainy, luminous green landscape. They could see the white foam of the destroyer's wake and the distant, dark shapes of the Iranian fast attack craft, 10 miles to the north. At coordinates 26 degrees north, 55 degrees east, the mission was no longer a drill. The helicopter was being launched as an over-the-horizon asset, tasked with identifying the lead vessels and providing the destroyer with a precise targeting solution. Mason, Easy Rider 6-2, engines are green, systems are go. The pilot's voice was clear over the radio, transmitted through the encrypted Link 16 data network, requesting permission to launch for immediate reconnaissance and engagement support. Easy Rider, Mason, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is 20 knots from the port bow. Godspeed. The yellow-shirted flight deck officer crossed the wands over his head, then pointed them toward the sea. The pilot increased the collective, the engines screaming as they fought the heavy, salt-laden air. The 10-ton helicopter lifted off the deck with a sudden, violent surge, the air pressure from the rotors momentarily flattening the spray against the ship's hull. Within seconds, the aircraft banked hard to the left, its navigation lights extinguished, disappearing into the blackness of the Gulf sky. The crew on the flight deck didn't stop to watch it go. They immediately began preparing the deck for a potential emergency recovery or the launch of a second bird. The heat from the helicopter's exhaust lingered for a moment, a searing pocket of air that smelled of burnt metal and kerosene, before the wind from the sea tore it away. From its new vantage point, 300 feet above the water, the helicopter crew could see the reality of the situation more clearly than anyone on the ship. The 14 Iranian boats were not just moving in a wedge. They were beginning to fan out, attempting to flank the destroyer. The infrared camera mounted under the nose of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter swiveled, locking onto the lead boat. On the co-pilot's multifunction display, the Iranian vessel was a bright white heat signature against the cold black of the water. They could see the spray from its bow and the thermal bloom of its high-performance engines. Bridge, Easy Rider 6-2. We have eyes on the swarm, the co-pilot reported, his fingers dancing over the weapon system controls. Targeting data is being pushed to your Aegis displays now. We count 14 hulls, all maintaining high speed. They are currently 9 miles from your position and closing. The MH-60 Sierra helicopter accelerated to 140 knots, staying just outside the range of any shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles the boats might be carrying. The pilots felt the airframe vibrate as they pushed into the wind, the salt spray beginning to coat the glass of the windscreen. Below them, the Iranian boats looked like small, fast predators chasing a SI-Dod, much larger prey. But with the helicopter now in the air, the balance of the hunt was shifting. The United States Navy had just extended its precumit, reach, and the Iranian formation was now within the lethal radius of the air-launched Hellfire missiles. 4:38 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Mason. The blue-tinted darkness of the command hub was punctuated only by the rhythmic flashing of red alert icons. The 14 Iranian fast-attack craft had just crossed the 8-mile threshold, ignoring the final non-lethal deterrence. The commanding officer's voice came through the internal circuit from the bridge, sharp and decisive. He was now communicating directly with the tactical action officer, who sat surrounded by a sea of glowing glass consoles. Combat. Bridge. The contacts have entered the 5-mile exclusion zone. They have ignored the acoustic device and the flares. I am declaring them hostile. You are authorized to use disabling force. Protect the ship. Copy. Bridge. Combat has the lead. Weapons are free. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from observation to execution. The tactical action officer turned to his fire control technicians. The air in the compartment felt thin, charged with the static electricity of dozens of high-powered servers running at peak capacity. The smell of recycled air and the faint, metallic tang of the cooling systems permeated the space. Every sailor in the room was focused on their specific sector of the tactical display, their hands hovering over the firing keys of the most advanced maritime defense system in the world. At latitude 26 degrees 12 minutes north and longitude 55 degrees 8 minutes east, the USS Mason began its defensive maneuver. The ship leaned hard into a 20-degree turn to starboard, the deck tilting beneath the crew's feet as the massive rudders redirected 60 knots of water. This maneuver was designed to bring the full weight of the ship's broadside weapons to bear: the 5-inch gun, the 25mm Bushmaster cannons, and the close-in weapon system. Targeting data confirmed, the fire control technician announced, his voice a low, steady drone. Easy Rider 6-2 has a laser lock on the lead 3 vessels. We are slaving the ship's fire control radar to their telemetry. Range is now 4 miles. Closing speed is 50 knots. Outside, the Gulf remained a wall of blackness, but on the screens, the battlefield was as clear as midday. The Iranian boats were no longer just symbols, they were targets with calculated trajectories and intercept points. The swarm was attempting a pincer movement, 3 boats splitting to the north and 3 to the south, while the remaining 8 maintained their charge toward the destroyer's midsection. It was a high-risk tactic designed to saturate the ship's sensors, but the Aegis system was built to handle hundreds of targets simultaneously. The tactical action officer adjusted his headset. Easy Rider, Mason, you are cleared to engage targets 1 through 3. Use Hellfire. We will follow with surface fire on the remaining formation. Acknowledge. Mason, Easy Rider. Acknowledged. Engaging targets 1, 2, and 3. Braking left. A mile above the water, the pilot of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter flipped the master arm switch to the on position. In the green-tinted world of his night vision goggles, the 4 Hellfire missiles on his wings were ready. The air screaming past the cockpit was the only sound other than his own breathing. He centered the crosshairs of the multispectral targeting system on the lead Iranian boat, a 20-ton craft bouncing violently over the swells. The exclusion zone had been breached, the warnings had been given, and the time for diplomacy ended in the dark waters of the Strait of Hormuz. 4:40 in the morning. The dark sky above the Strait of Hormuz, the MH-60 Sierra helicopter banked hard, its rotors biting into the humid air. As the pilot finalized the laser track on the lead Iranian vessel, The exclusion zone had been crossed, and the engagement was no longer a theoretical exercise. The air inside the cockpit was silent, save for the electronic tone of the missile seeker locking onto the thermal signature of a blow. High-speed engine 4 miles below. Rifle. 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 The co-pilot called out as he squeezed the trigger. The first Hellfire missile dropped from the rail, its rocket motor igniting with a brilliant white flash that momentarily bleached the green tint of the fondant. Pilot's night vision goggles. The missile shrieked forward, a column of orange fire punching through the blackness of the Gulf night. The heat from the propellant was so intense it could be felt through the fuselage of the helicopter as the weapon accelerated to Mach 1.3. 2 seconds later, a second and third missile followed in rapid succession, their exhaust trails carving glowing arcs across the horizon. Below, the lead Iranian fast attack craft never had a chance to maneuver. The first Hellfire missile punched straight through the fiberglass hull just above the waterline, the shaped charge warhead detonating with surgical precision. The internal explosion ignited the boat's fuel tanks and the ready-use ammunition for its heavy machine guns. A fireball erupted instantly, rising 30 meters into the air and turning the surrounding water into a shimmering pool of orange light. The boat was obliterated, its remains scattered across a 100-meter radius of the sea in a rain of burning debris. The second and third missiles struck their targets less than 4 seconds later. One boat was hit directly in the engine compartment, the force of the blast throwing the entire vessel 3 meters out of the water before it slammed back down and began to sink stern first. The other took the hit midships, the explosion severing the hull into 2 distinct pieces that drifted apart in a cloud of thick, black chemical smoke. The smell of burning oil and scorched metal rose from the water, even as the shock waves of the detonations rattled the windows of the destroyer. 5 miles away. The defenders' reaction was immediate and chaotic. The remaining 11 boats, seeing their leadership vaporized in a matter of seconds, broke their rigid wedge formation. Some veered sharply to the east, their hulls slapping violently against the 2-meter swells as they tried to put distance between themselves and the aerial threat. Others, driven by panic or a final act of defiance, increased their speed, zigzagging toward the USS Mason in a desperate attempt to close the gap before the next strike. The Gulf was no longer dark. The 3 burning wrecks acted as massive pyres, casting a flickering, hellish light over the waves. The silence of the night was replaced by the distant, muffled thuds of the secondary explosions as ammunition on the silence band, sinking boats cooked off. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the crew watched the infrared monitors as 3 white heat signatures bloomed, and then slowly faded as they slipped beneath the surface. The first phase of the engagement was over, but the remaining 11 targets were now within range of the ship's own heavy guns. 4:42 in the morning. The forward deck of the USS Mason, the 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun, located on the forecastle, slewed toward the northern afterspec horizon with a mechanical whir that vibrated through the entire hull. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer had already designated the next target in the surviving Iranian formation, a fast attack boat that was attempting to close the distance from the port side. The gun's automated loading system cycled a 60-pound high-explosive projectile into the breach with a sharp, metallic clack that resonated through the steel bulkheads. Gun 1, clear to engage Target 4, the tactical action officer commanded. A split second later, the ship's forward deck was engulfed in a massive, orange muzzle flash that illuminated the destroyer's superstructure for miles. The concussion from the gun was a physical blow, a massive overpressure wave that rattled the bridge windows and sent a cloud of gray cordite smoke tumbling over the water. The sound was a sharp, thunderous crack that felt as if it had split the air itself. The 60-pound shell traveled at 800 meters per second, guided by the ship's primary radar. It impacted the Iranian boat 4 miles out, the point-detonating fuse triggering the moment the shell touched the vessel's bow. The result was catastrophic. The front third of the boat vanished in a spray of fiberglass, metal, and water. The remaining section of the hull was flipped over. By the kinetic energy of the impact, the engines still screaming as they were dragged beneath the surface. The destroyer did not pause. The gun barrel adjusted its elevation by a fraction of a degree, and another round was sent screaming into the dark. On the starboard rail, the 25mm cannons began their own rhythmic thump-thump-thump, sending long streams of tracer fire arching across the water. The red glowing rounds looked like laser beams in the humid night air, skipping off the surface of the swells before finding their targets. The Iranian crews were now in full retreat, but the speed of the engagement had outpaced their ability to escape. The air over the Gulf was filled with the acrid stink of burnt powder and the heavy smell of salt spray churned up by the ship's erratic maneuvers. Every time the 5-inch gun fired, the deck shuddered, and the crew on the bridge could feel the heat from the muzzle blast even through the reinforced glass. 3 more boats were struck in rapid succession. One was hit by a volley of 25mm rounds that tore through its fuel lines, causing it to erupt into a bright blue flare of burning gasoline. Another was simply pulverized by a direct hit from the main gun, leaving nothing behind but a slick of oil and a few floating pieces of debris. The remaining 5 boats were now scattered, their formation completely broken, as they realized they were no longer in a skirmish, but a slaughter. 4:45 in the morning. The starboard rail of the USS Mason. The remaining Iranian fast attack craft had closed the distance to less than 2,000 meters, moving in a desperate, final dash toward the destroyer's midsection. At this range, the ship's primary radar handed off the tracking to the close-in weapon system, the Phalanx Mark 15. The radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun began to slew with a 20mm Gatling gun, high-pitched, mechanical whine that could be heard even through the armored bulkheads of the ship. Targeting lock confirmed. Engagement zone established, the weapons officer reported, his thumb hovering over the final authorization. Engaging. The close-in weapon system erupted in a continuous, deafening roar that sounded less like a gun and more like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half. A stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds poured out of the barrels at a rate of 75 rounds per second, creating a solid line of white-hot tracers that reached out and touched the lead Iranian boat. The trigger was held for a 3-second burst, the mechanical vibration shaking the entire superstructure of the ship and filling the air with the sharp ozone smell of high-voltage electronics and burnt lubricant. The impact was absolute. The stream of 20mm rounds punched straight through the light armor of the lead boat's cabin, shredding the fiberglass and the personnel inside in a matter of heartbeats. The tungsten penetrators drove into the engine block, the kinetic energy causing the metal to shatter and liquefy instantly. The boat didn't just stop, it disintegrated. The hull split along the waterline, and the entire forward section was crushed into a somely, twisted mass of scrap that was sent flying into the air before falling back into the churning wake. The defenders' reaction was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The last 3 boats, seeing their comrade vaporized by the wall of lead, attempted to execute an emergency turn to the west. But the high-speed maneuver in the heavy swells caused 2 of the boats to collide, their hulls scraping and locking. Together in a shower of sparks and grinding metal, they were dead in the water, trapped in a tangle of ruined fiberglass. The 25mm Bushmaster cannons on the port side finished the work. A series of controlled bursts slammed into the locked vessels, the high-explosive rounds driving into the fuel reservoirs. A fireball bleached the sky white, the heat blast washing across the destroyer's deck even at a distance of 1,500 meters. The temperature in the center of the explosion reached thousands of degrees, causing the metal structures on the boats to sag and melt before the hulls finally gave way. Within 60 seconds, the roar of the ship's guns faded into a dead silence, broken only by the sound of the wind and the hiss of the destroyer's wake. Where 14 boats had been charging just minutes before, there was now only a graveyard of burning wreckage. Black smoke rose in pillars against the pre-dawn sky. The orange glow of the 2020-12 fires reflecting off the oily surface of the water. The threat had been neutralized, the kill zone was empty, and the Gulf was once again reclaimed by the heavy, silent mist. 5 in the morning. The waters off the coast of Kesham Island. The heavy thunder of the 5-inch gun and the high-pitched scream of the close-in weapon system had finally ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. The naval warship began to slow its transit, the massive wake behind the ship settling into a series of rolling, oil-slicked swells. On the bridge, the green glow of the radar screens showed a clean horizon, save for the flickering, stationary heat signatures of the 14 targets that had existed only 10 minutes prior. The air was thick with the acrid, lingering stink of cordite and the heavy, black smoke drifting from the remains of the foreign formation. The commanding officer moved to the bridge wing, his boots crunching on a few stray brass casings that had bounced from the upper decks. He raised his binoculars, scanning the debris field 2 miles to the north. The Gulf, usually a deep navy blue in the pre-dawn light, was now a graveyard of floating fiberglass, orange life jackets, and dark patches of spreading fuel. The fires from the larger wreckage were still burning, their flames licking at the humid air and casting long, dancing shadows across the water. Bridge. Combat. The tactical action officer's voice came over the internal circuit, quieter now, the adrenaline of the engagement beginning to ebb. All 14 targets are confirmed destroyed. We are monitoring for any secondary surface or subsurface contacts. The area is currently clear, requesting permission to initiate a search and rescue sweep for survivors. Approved. Combat. The commanding officer replied, his voice raspy from the tension. But keep the ship at modified general quarters. I want the 25mm teams on the rails and the helicopter holding station at 1,000 feet. We don't know if they have friends nearby. The destroyer began a slow, methodical turn, its powerful bow cutting through a patch of floating debris that looked like the remains of a bridge console. As the ship moved through the impact zone, the crew on the rails could see the extent of the destruction. The water was littered with the physical evidence of a high kinetic engagement: splintered wood, twisted metal shards, and the occasional burst of white foam from a sinking fuel tank. There was no sound of voices, only the rhythmic slap-slap of the waves against the destroyer's hull and the distant, fading whine of the military helicopter's engines. The search and rescue effort was a requirement of international maritime law, but it was also a grim technical necessity. The crew needed to confirm the identity of the vessels and ensure no manned platforms remained as a threat. The ship's powerful searchlights swept the water, the white beams cutting through the smoke and illuminating the surface like a surgical theater. They found several unoccupied life rafts, their orange fabric shredded by the close-in weapon system's fire. But no survivors were visible in the immediate vicinity of the main debris field. In the belly of the ship, the logistics and damage control teams began their own assessment. The all clear for the internal compartments had been given, but the mechanical stress of the high-speed maneuvers and the concussion of the main gun had to be accounted for. The smell of salt spray and diesel was everywhere, pulled in by the ship's massive air intakes during the fight. The deck was still slick, with a fine mist of seawater and hydraulic fluid. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, a thin line of bruised purple and orange that highlighted the jagged peaks of the foreign coastline 30 miles away. The naval warship sat at the center of this new, violent landscape, a silent sentinel in a sea of wreckage. The first phase of the aftermath was beginning the transition from active combat to the cold, clinical reality of casualty assessment and site security. The battle was over, but the work of the military forces in the strategic maritime strait was far from finished. 5:15 in the morning. The main deck and technical spaces of the USS Mason. The immediate roar of combat had faded, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical sounds of a warship returning to a state of sustained readiness. In the belly of the destroyer, the technical teams began a comprehensive damage and munitions report. The air in the magazine spaces was cool and smelled of dry lubricant and ozone. The automated elevators of the Mark 41 vertical launch system remained sealed, but the inventory for the surface-to-surface weapons showed the calculated cost of the engagement. The ship's logistics officer moved through the Combat Information Center with a digital tablet, recording the expenditure of munitions in spoken words for the final report. The 5-inch Mark 45 naval gun had expended 12 high-explosive projectiles. The 25mm Bushmaster cannons had fired 340 rounds of ammunition. The close-in weapon system, in its 3-second bursts of defensive fire, had cycled through 225 tungsten penetrators. On the flight deck, the military helicopter had returned with 3 empty missile rails. Bridge. Logistics. The officer reported over the internal loop. Main battery remains at 95% capacity. Close-in weapon system has been reloaded and bore sighted. We are ready for a second engagement, if required. On the exterior of the ship, damage control teams in blue coveralls moved along the port and starboard rails, their flashlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. They were looking for any signs of near-miss damage. Small punctures from debris or stress fractures in the hull caused by the violent, high-speed maneuvers. The sea had been running 2-meter swells during the height of the fight, and the destroyer had taken several heavy rolls that had tested the lashings of every piece of equipment. The smell of burnt powder still hung in the damp morning air, clinging to the gray paint of the superstructure. In the engineering spaces, the 4 gas turbine engines were being monitored for thermal stress. They had been pushed to their maximum output for nearly 40 minutes, consuming thousands of gallons of JF5 fuel to keep the ship moving at combat speeds. The vibration in the deck plates had smoothed out as the ship settled back to a standard patrol speed of 15 knots, but the heat radiating from the exhaust stacks was still intense enough to distort the air. The crew on the bridge worked through a checklist of system diagnostics. Every sensor, from an SPY-6 radar to the towed sonar array, had to be verified. In a high-intensity swarm engagement, the primary danger to a destroyer is not just the direct fire, but the potential for a secondary electronic or subsurface attack while the crew is focused on the visible threat. The electronic warfare suite was run through a full BIT test, its cooling fans humming as it scanned the spectrum for any signs of incoming anti-ship missile seekers. Outside, the first real light of day began to reveal the true scale of the debris field. The orange fires on the water were dying down, leaving behind only smoldering patches of dark oil and floating fragments of white fiberglass. The naval warship moved slowly through the center of the graveyard, its sensors recording the GPS coordinates of every major piece of wreckage. The technical evaluation was nearly complete. The ship was fully functional. Its systems had performed to specification, and the crew had maintained the discipline required to win a multi-axis engagement without a single American casualty. 6 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long, golden light across the surface of the Persian Gulf. The USS Mason had completed its final sweep of the engagement zone at coordinates 26 degrees north, 55 degrees east. The 14 Iranian fast attack craft were gone, replaced by a thin, shimmering slick of oil that stretched for 3 miles toward the coast. The air, which had been thick with the smell of cordite and burning fuel just an hour ago, was now beginning to carry the familiar, clean scent of the open sea. On the bridge, the red battle lights were extinguished, replaced by the natural morning light. The crew remained at a heightened state of readiness, but the immediate tension had dissipated into a quiet, professional exhaustion. The commanding officer sat in his chair, watching the horizon as a merchant tanker, the Star of Neptune, appeared on the radar 3 miles to the south. The tanker was moving toward the open waters of the Arabian Sea, its transit made possible by the decisive actions of the destroyer and its crew. The strategic objective had been achieved. The military forces had successfully defended its position in international waters and ensured that the world's most critical maritime choke point remained open for commerce. In the intelligence facility, the final mission report was being encrypted for transmission. The report detailed the timeline of the engagement, the specific munitions expended, and the total destruction of the 14 hostile vessels. It was a clinical, data-driven account of a battle that had lasted less than 30 minutes, but would have lasting geopolitical implications. The cost of the engagement was severe for the foreign military forces, which had lost 14 high-performance vessels and dozens of personnel in a matter of minutes. For the military forces, the cost was measured in fuel and ammunition, with the naval warship reporting 0 personnel injuries and only minor cosmetic damage. The destroyer began to increase its speed to 20 knots, its bow turning south toward the deeper waters of the Gulf of Oman. The military helicopter was recovered for the final time, its wheels touching down on the flight deck with a soft thud. The engines were cut, and as the rotors slowed to a halt, the silence of the morning returned. The flight deck crew moved in to secure the aircraft, their movements slow and deliberate in the growing heat of the day. The ship's loudspeaker system crackled to life, the commanding officer's voice echoing through the passageways and berthing areas. "This is the captain. The threat has been neutralized. The ship and all personnel are safe. We are returning to our standard patrol pattern. You performed exactly as you were trained. Well done." The naval warship moved forward, a lone, gray silhouette against the bright glare of the rising sun. Behind it, the debris from the 14 boats continued to drift toward the coastline, a silent warning to any who would deign challenge the freedom of the seas. The Strait of Hormuz was once again quiet, the heavy mist of the morning burning off as the temperature began its climb toward 40 degrees. The mission was complete. The objective was secured, and the military forces remained on station, ready for the next watch.